This is Duke University.
So welcome, everyone. I'm really delighted to introduce my colleague and very good friend, Jed Purdy, the Robinson O. Everett Professor of Law. Even if I did not believe in short introductions, which you'll be happy to know I do, I could not do justice to any aspect of Jed Purdy in a reasonable amount of time. So I encourage you to start reading his work, and you'll see what I mean. Professor Purdy has been at Duke since 2004, where he has taught a wide range of courses, including several team taught classes in arts and sciences, which is quite unusual for the law school. A graduate of Harvard Social Studies major prior to Yale Law School, he is committed to the kind of cross-disciplinary research, teaching, and learning that most fully helps us address the questions and problems we encounter in the contemporary world. He is committed as well to socially engaged scholarship in which justice is an ongoing question and goal. He writes for wide and varied audiences, from legal scholars to the general public. He is the very definition of a public intellectual and shows how that designation absolutely does not entail superficiality. He has the enviable quality to present very complex ideas accessibly and elegantly. And his work is characterized by an unabashed belief in the possibility of transformation and the ideal of justice. You cannot talk with Professor Purdy without knowing you are in the presence of a rare intellect, discerning, sharp, and expansive, but you are inevitably struck as well by his humility, graciousness, generosity, and passion. Professor Purdy's 5 books include a trilogy on U.S. political identity, concluding with A Tolerable Anarchy in 2009, The Meaning of Property, 2010, and most recently, those are 2 different books. Tolerable Anarchy was the end of the trilogy. The Meaning of Property came out in 2010, and most recently, his magisterial history of environmental law and culture, his impassioned call for a more expansive, compassionate, and intelligent way of understanding and inhabiting the world. After Nature, A Politics for the Anthropocene, which has been nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, if anyone didn't know that, and from which he will be reading this afternoon. Join me in welcoming Professor Purdy.
It's true that Priscilla is one of the most generous people in the world, and not only in the respect that you just saw. Thanks a lot. It's nice to be introduced by a friend. I will be reading from the book. I feel a little peculiar about that because finding your prose in your own mouth can be a strangely alienating experience. Maybe some of you know what I mean. But on reflection, the reason to make a book out of it is to try to put it more exactly and weigh the words more precisely than I can do extemporaneously. So if you'll forgive me the weirdness of reading you a few sections from the book that I think capture some of its major claims, then that'll give us, I hope, a starting point for a conversation. Officially, for the past 11,700 years, we've been living in the Holocene epoch. The Holocene, which takes its name from the Greek for totally new, is an eye blink in geological time. During its nearly 12,000 years, plate tectonics has driven the continents a little more than half a mile. A reasonably fit person could cover the scale of planetary change in a brisk 8-minute walk. It's been a warm time, when temperature has mattered as much as tectonics. Sea levels rose 115 feet as ice melted, and northern landscapes rose almost 600 feet, rebounding from the weight of now melted glaciers. But the real news in the Holocene has been people. Estimates put the global human population between 1 million and 10 million at the start of the Holocene, and keep it in that range until after the agricultural revolution, some 5,000 years ago. Since then, we've made the world our anthill. The geological layers we're now laying down on the Earth's surface are marked by our chemicals and other industrial emissions, the pollens of our crops, and the absence of the many species we've driven to extinction. Rising sea levels are now our doing. Humanity has joined geology as a driver of global change. The Anthropocene, the name for the era whose condition I just described, the era when humanity counts as a force shaping the planet, marks the last of three revolutions. Three kinds of order, once thought to be natural and self-sustaining, have shown themselves to be artificial, fragile, and potentially self-immolating. The first to fall was politics. Long seen as part of divine design, with kings serving as the human equivalents of lions in the desert and eagles in the sky, politics proved instead a dangerous but inescapable form of architecture, a blueprint for peaceful coexistence built with crooked materials. Second came economics. Once presented as a gift of providence or an outgrowth of human nature, economic life, like politics, turned out to be a deliberate and artificial achievement and vulnerable to its own kinds of crises. Now in the Anthropocene, we have to add nature itself to the list of things that are not natural. In every respect, the world we inhabit will henceforth be the world we've made. The revolution in ideas that the Anthropocene represents, the end of the division between people and nature, is rooted in hundreds of eminently practical problems. The conversation about climate change has shifted from whether we can keep greenhouse gas concentrations below key thresholds to how we're going to adapt when they cross those thresholds and change everything from global weather to the acidity of the oceans. Geoengineering, deliberate intervention in planetary systems, which used to be the unspeakable proposal, is in the mix of responses now and almost sure to grow more prominent. As climate change shifts ecological boundaries, problems like habitat preservation come to resemble landscape architecture. We can't just pen in animals to save them. We need to secure migration corridors and help species move as their habitats lurch across a changing map. There's open talk in law and policy circles about triage in species preservation, asking what we can save and what we most want to save. We can call the sum of these changes, the vast and irreversible human impact on the planet, the Anthropocene condition. Now I want to read from a section that has to do with ways of imagining and encountering the non-human world and what we can begin making of those in this new setting. And I've chopped up this segment, so you may hear the chopping a little in my voice to try to make it fit the time. Come forth into the light of things, wrote Wordsworth in 1798. Let nature be your teacher. To his mind, the woods in springtime revealed more about good and evil than the teachings of all religions. Observe nature and follow the path it maps out for you, Rousseau had advised in Emile, his treatise on education and moral development. The book was a guide to preserving the natural goodness and temperance of humanity against the vanity, excess, and anxiety that infected social life. Everything is good as it leaves the hands of the author, Rousseau wrote. It was good just as nature made it, and to force it into some other form was corruption. And for every claim that nature supported a revolutionary vision of human freedom, someone was prepared to testify to the contrary, that nature was the guarantor of hierarchy and tradition. A century before Rousseau, John Evelyn, the English forester and author of the first tract on air pollution in 1661, the wonderfully named Fumifugium, praised nature for being terrifying. Terror, he wrote, was a lesson in obedience. Even atheists shuddered when they heard thunder. You may have seen Ross Douthat in the New York Times the other day pointing out that even atheists see ghosts. Some things never change. Crashing storms were reminders that people were sinners in the hands of an unrelenting God. John Ray, a pioneering naturalist, a generation after Evelyn, argued that insect swarms were nature's scourges, reminders that divine order dealt harshly with rebels. the locusts were sure to come for atheists and Democrats, delivering nature's judgment on their deranged ideas. Where Rousseau and Wordsworth saw a proto-democratic nature, pregnant with harmonious equality, Evelyn and Ray portrayed a nature made for piety and monarchy. This natural order taught discipline, obedience, and mutual subserviency, their phrase. Nature turns out to be flexible like that. It's been the handmaiden of revolutions and the underwriter of kings, proof of divine design and of atheistic materialism, from Athens and Rome down to the age of democracy. It's proved and disproved the justice of slavery. The most natural of peoples, Native Americans as Europeans imagined them, stood as a rebuke to decadent civilization, except when the study of nature revealed, as it did to John Locke, that the indolent tribes must give way to the industrious and rational Europeans for whom nature was made. So John Stuart Mill called all political appeals to nature nasty and obscuring. They superstitiously projected human values onto a mute and violent natural world, usually to defend a narrow and reactionary interest, like the subjection of women, the preservation of slavery, or the glory of the monarchy. The doctrine that man ought to follow nature, he wrote, is equally irrational and immoral. For Mill, the human duty was instead to struggle against nature, to drain swamps, channel rivers, and overcome our own natural barbarism, our love of power, our cruelty toward the weak, and our subservience to authority. Our purpose was to replace nature with art. This brief view of nature's ethical, political, and cultural uses is a reminder of why Wordsworth's invitation, "Let nature be your teacher," seems so quaint today. Most of us know or suspect what history bears out, that nature has been a vessel for many inconsistent ideas, whether one claims to be following it or overcoming it. When we hear opponents of gay rights denounce unnatural sexuality, we may agree with Mill that nature in politics is an honorific for prejudice. But we also know that Mill's humanist program to master and reform nature is not innocent and fostered its own kinds of moral blindness. Mill's rationalism and faith in progress nourished his enthusiasm for British Empire and India, which he saw as an unregenerate mass of all too natural humanity that must be reformed. Americans who followed Mill's call to transform nature were sometimes imperialists too, spinning administrative schemes for Native American resettlement and military expeditions to Cuba and the Philippines. Some were enthusiastic eugenicists, sure that if nature needed to be overcome and perfected, human nature was the place to begin. These agendas were integrally related to their ideas of nature, which might give one pause about harboring any idea of nature at all. Maybe nature is one of those ideas, like race, that confuse more than they illuminate and do more harm than good. At the same time, Wordsworth's picture of a deeply felt response to the natural world still resonates. I guess that most readers of this book have known some of the following experiences. You might have identified with, felt uniquely at home in, some landscape, whether the one where you grew up, the one you moved to as soon as adulthood allowed, or the one that you've only visited or glimpsed or imagined, but that has always had a special claim on you. You might have walked into mountains or woods and after a few hours felt clearer, more alive, vividly aware of what matters to you and what's just distraction and time wasting. Or you might have woken up on a farm and felt intensely the nearness of living things, the ways that plants, animals, and soil are linked in growth, eating, and decay. And many of the most intense encounters with the non-human world are strange and disruptive, not lessons in any kind of harmony. You might have felt the macabre fascination, stumbling across a decaying carcass and feeling your eye focus on a seething layer of maggots, or held a cut of meat and sensed the spooky familiarity of the joints where it was cleaved, which correspond all too neatly to those of your own body. Maybe you helped to slaughter something, a chicken or a lamb, and felt in its brief struggle and spasms the transmission of a terror to your nerves that took hours or days to seep back out and left you wondering about the boundaries of species and sympathy. Maybe you've been terrified, caught in a strong current, separated from a friend on a windy ridge, drunk or high in a dark forest, and found yourself half panicked, superstitiously bargaining with higher powers for your survival, and then set aside the superstition with amusement and a little disgust when you were safe again. The nature that Wordsworth portrayed as harmonious in his carefully formed lines is all of these things, too, and so is the human mind that receives and answers it. Come forth into the light of things, more like the cacophony of things, including many irresolvable contests over the meaning of nature. We know too much and we felt too many things to learn in good conscience from the natural world. So I then ask myself, why talk about an intensified politics of nature rather than a politics without nature? Why not say that nature, that all too flexible argument stopper, which never quite succeeds in ending the argument, is just an archaic way of talking and thinking, best overcome and discarded? There are several reasons I don't think this is either possible or desirable. The most telling is that ideas about nature have been much more than rhetorical flourishes or metaphysical gloss. They've deeply shaped the landscapes, economies, and social practices in which we continue to live. The material world, so-called natural and so-called artificial, that we inhabit, is in many ways a memorial to a long-running legacy of contested ideas about nature, how it works, how we fit into it, and what we have at stake in doing right by it. What does it mean to say that ideas have shaped landscapes? Is this an idealist history that imagines that concepts create events? No, but it is history that takes ideas seriously in quite a specific way. We shape the world. There's a basic Anthropocene premise. We shape the world by living. Our lives knit into a kind of collective landscape architecture by the ways we eat, move around, stay warm and cool, and amuse ourselves. We create the subsystems of a vast metabolism tying us at every point to our environment. We call these subsystems the energy economy, the food economy, the transportation system, and shelter, cities and suburbs. American environmental laws, which orchestrate this activity, may be sorted, here I brutally summarize, according to 4 pictures of the natural world, which they body forward into this kind of landscape architecture that I'm talking about. I call them in the book the providential, the romantic, the utilitarian, and the ecological. We can talk more about those if you want. Each image contributed to forming a landscape as well as to shaping a mode of identity, activity, and experience on the land. Consider the pro-development laws infused with the providential vision that turned early Americans into an army of settlers. Under their aegis, pioneers treated the world as conditionally bountiful, the way providential imagination drew it. The Jeffersonian surveyor's grid and the statutes creating private farms produced an American geography where these providential attitudes made sense as a human relation to nature. This was true even to the point of making settlers blind to the inconvenient facts of weather and geography. The repeating rectangles of the settlement grid galloped over streams and wetlands and mounted the high plains where rainfall was too scant to support farming. After a few unusually wet summers and warm winters, the seasons returned to normal and threw back the settlers, who became the first modern ecological refugees in North America. The fact that the land itself curtailed settlement in this case only highlights by contrast how successful the project of continental settlement otherwise was. The ecological transformation and the cultural developments around it were world historical, yet Americans often discussed them as if they were the most natural things in the world, the expected upshot of a people meeting a continent. Soon another wave of settlers returned to the Great Plains, armed with technology to extend the grid westward, its lines now forming the crop circles of a center pivot irrigation. A vision suffused these clearing and settlement efforts, a picture of nature with religious and philosophical sources. The world was a potential garden that existed to serve human needs, but only if people developed it with labor and settlement. This vision was the keystone of an idea of national mission, turning the continent into private property. It linked economic development to a cosmology and a sense of planetary purpose. It helped to underwrite the dignity of labor in a democratic culture that increasingly embraced the equal standing of all its white male members. The second great American picture of nature, the Romantic one, has also relied on law to anchor experience and activity that, in turn, made real a way of encountering nature. Seen in a romantic light, the most extreme and dramatic places inspire epiphany, flashes of insight into the order of things and one's place in it. One encounters divinity and one's own self on a mountain peak, in the rainbow-laced spray of a crashing waterfall, or at the lip of a deep crevasse. John Muir called Yosemite Valley's South Dome full of thought, clothed with living light, no sense of dead stone about it, all spiritualized, steadfast and serene strength, like a god. Drawing on literary sources like Wordsworth and Emerson, early Romantic social movements, especially the Sierra Club, wove these themes into the landscapes of California's Sierra Nevada and other Western high country. And soon they were working to ensure that American law dedicated large tracts of ground, such as Yosemite, to visual delight and inspiration. Although many of the national parks were founded on the non-romantic theory that they'd nurture public health and civic spirit, by the 1920s, the Park Service itself was calling them shrines to nature and to the human spirit that it trained. So these parks made the romantic way of meeting nature into real and widespread experience. Public wildlands were dedicated by congressional action to a picture of nature as a spiritual destination, a site for pilgrimage, and in turn those lands make that cultural idea of nature a physical reality for the sojourners. Their material landscape brings alive a cultural practice of aesthetics and spirituality. These landscapes were inspired by ideas, but the ideas can enter lived experience only because the landscapes exist. So humans spell out their imagination in the landscapes they shape, and the landscapes write their forms on human experience and the imagination it fosters. And these are all unequal landscapes. The four pictures of the natural world that have most markedly shaped American law and so American geography are each an imperial conqueror. They've covered the continent like Jefferson's grid, where many other landscapes and experiences remain peripheral to this American geography, or are foreclosed outright. Native American farming practices are gone, now glimpsed only in traces of the deep red so-called Indian corn called Bloody Butcher that's still grown in the folds of central Appalachia where I grew up. Hunting and gathering as a way of life is gone too, though echoed in country foraging traditions and their urban revivals. The gardens that enslaved people kept on plantations and that some of their descendants brought north generations later in the Great Migration are mostly forgotten in these dominant forms of environmental imagination. There's been room only on the margins for the plots cultivated by new arrivals from Latin America, East Asia, and elsewhere. There are many rich stories to tell about these experiences, some of them centered on violence and injustice, some on solidarity and pleasure seized in places that remain mostly invisible to those who don't live there. I come from a marginal American landscape, one that doesn't fit the big pictures and grand stories so well. I know there's no equality among American landscapes. Some are treated as sacred, some guided into many generations of habitation and use, others sacrificed in just a few years. And so, there's no equality among Americans who care about their landscapes and wish to imagine that their children and grandchildren might live there somewhat as they have. If you live in a wooded suburb of Boston and treasure the preserved lands next door, if you live in the dense neighborhoods of Boulder, Colorado, and like to go to Rocky Mountain National Park for your summer hikes, your relation to the land is secure, a privilege enshrined in law. But if you love the hills of southern West Virginia or eastern Kentucky, if they form your idea of beauty and rest, your native or chosen image of home, then your love has prepared your heart for breaking. If politics will determine the shape of the Anthropocene, consider one dystopian prospect. Dystopian prospect. Earlier versions of nature have concealed inequality among people, their landscapes, and their forms of life by naturalizing that inequality, treating it as a simple aspect of the given world. Theories of race and sex, of the inherent direction of history, or of the purpose for which the natural world is designed have all done this work. And these are not gone, of course. Indeed, their traces are everywhere and transformed, but in their raw form, as it were, they're greatly weakened. The more distinctive and potent danger today is a naturalized version of post-natural human mastery. That is, the danger is in an approach to the Anthropocene that rhetorically embraces the need for humans to shape the world, that cuts off all avenues of radical and generative politics about how to do that, reducing our Anthropocene choices to a convenient minimum. As economy, ecology, and politics unite with growing intensity, the natural world itself will enforce unequal economic and political power. Wealth has always meant the power to resist natural shocks and carry on with one's life. Wealth commands vaccines and antibiotics, upland real estate, reliable flows of food and water when drought strikes. In these ways, natural catastrophe amplifies existing inequality. When sea levels rise, malaria spreads, storms intensify, low-lying and poor regions see their poverty confirmed by disasters for which no one can quite be blamed, while rich countries, even ones that have started out as haplessly as the United States has on climate change, will build seawalls and innovatively adaptive buildings and cities. The global atmosphere is a great launderer of historical contributions to and benefits from inequality. Everything washes out in the weather. The fact that Europeans enjoyed technological and immunological advantages over Native Americans and other indigenous peoples once seemed to show that they were favored by providence or racial destiny. In the same way, the disasters of the Anthropocene will seem to confirm the rich country's resilience, flexibility, entrepreneurial capacity, and that everlasting mark of being touched by the gods. Good luck. But luck, of course, is the residue of historical and structural advantage. It's too anodyne to say that climate change creates hazards for which wealthy countries are better prepared. It's more accurate to say that it creates a global landscape of inequality, one in which the already wealthy peoples who have contributed most to the problem see their advantages multiplied. As human pressure shapes the planet and global inequality inflects that shaping, new landscape-level inequalities will emerge. Already many millions of acres of rich agricultural land in Africa and elsewhere are under leases of 100 years or longer to feed burgeoning China as it dives into meat-eating and obesity and builds cities on its farmland. Once, in a world of scarcity, peasants produced for lords and priests in a landscape that mapped out hierarchical bonds and different claims to the land. Such intense inequality has persisted on the global scale, but been concealed and made politically avoidable by distance, literal distance, but also social and imaginative distance, the distance of those who don't believe their lives are entangled with the lives of others. Now, as competition for resources gets more severe, we may reproduce by region and continent the landscape of inequality that feudal society enforced field by field and family by family. It was once hard to imagine that landlords would starve, even when the crops failed and spring came late. Will it be hard to imagine that China, let alone the United States or Europe, might sacrifice its appetites when other bellies are tight? The prospect is similar for water as global demand outstrips total supply. Rich regions will become, to use an American image, the Los Angeles of the world's water, surviving on the rains of other lands, transferred across deserts by technology and wealth. Some places will become uninhabitable so that others can remain ecological exemption zones where no cities would be possible without massive hydroengineering. These exemptions will become increasingly invisible as the engineering becomes more pervasive, just as we seldom think today of skyscrapers and suburbs in the American South as exemptions because they rely on air conditioning to keep up year-round business and busyness, or of dense cities in general as exemptions because vaccination and clean water save their residents from epidemics. But the half-hidden logic of a world of scarcity will be a landscape of artificial drought and plenty. I would call this dystopia the Neoliberal Anthropocene. It's distinguished by free contract within a global market, which launders inequality to the point of political invisibility. In the Neoliberal Anthropocene, sorry, I was skipping. The 100-year leases that, I'll go back, the 100-year leases that African governments are entering into with China may look like the extractive imperialism that marred world maps for centuries, but they're agreements entered into with open eyes by governments that, in theory, are equally sovereign. It's another question whether this justifies the inequalities that result, especially considering that the agreements are themselves the product of underlying inequalities. In the neoliberal Anthropocene, that would hardly be a question at all. This version of the Anthropocene does not treat it as a source of new political questions, but simply envisions ever-intensified management of the globe carried forward by market means, beginning from our vast present inequality. If scarcity and environmental disruption tighten under these conditions, the planet will become a man-made unequal landscape, a dispersed and interconnected version of a feudal manor or an occupied territory, but one constructed out of market materials, free agreement backed by wealth. The alternative would be a democratic Anthropocene. It would begin by extending a famous observation of Amartya Sen's, that although many people have died of starvation in modern times, no democracy has ever suffered a famine. Sen's point, of course, is that famines are not natural products of absolute scarcity, but political products of distribution. Famines occur when some who have enough or more than enough can ignore others who do not. By tying together the fates of rich and poor, rulers and ruled, democracy puts a limit on such indifference. It's a broad limit that doesn't guarantee anything like equality or even decent treatment, but it's a limit nonetheless. Extending Sen's point would mean accepting that in the Anthropocene, landscapes of inequality are human creations, and our decisions whether to create, tolerate, or change them are all political. The neoliberal Anthropocene would be a politics of the Anthropocene, but a self-straightened one, implicitly committed to man-made ecologies that amplify existing inequality. Lots more to say, but I think that's a good place to stop.
My sense when you're talking about justice and trying to get a broad vision of that, you use planetary. When you're talking about a specific movement, obviously, you use environmental, but you also use environmental the way that people have used nature. But with a little broader, because it might be urban, it's surroundings.
Yes.
And ecological for you is not just interdependence, but conviction, sense of connection. I would say almost a theology.
It's certainly an aesthetic. Yeah.
You want this?
No, it's it's certainly an aesthetic. Probably I should give this to you, otherwise I'm going to get some sort of mid-career Neil Young feedback thing going on between the microphones.
We could sing.
There are so many things we could do at this moment that we won't. So the ecological is definitely an aesthetic, a way of seeing and imagining the world, a way of noticing patterns, a way of bringing them to the fore in your attention and your sight, that I think is often taken to imply an ethic, and it's an ethic that I think is actually eminently worth embracing and putting to political work, which is an ethic of interdependence and of unavoidable mutual responsibility taking. I think the planetary which has become inescapably the scale of these concerns. And so is the scale on which certain kinds of calls for justice and responsibility taking, which is sort of a moralized way of saying being intentional about what we're doing, being self-aware about what we're doing, has to happen. And in a sense, it's heartbreaking that this is true, because the gap between the scale of the problems and the scale of our capacity to respond in quite concrete ways, institutionally, at the level of movements, at the level of the bonds of sympathy and imagination and political pressure that move things, the gap is so vast. I actually started this book in a way as a very parochial reaction, not this book, but the project that sort of fed into it, as a very parochial reaction to something that was happening in environmental law and policy scholarship, which was an absolute fetish of a certain kind of rational choice methodology that fascinated and enchanted itself by showing in ever more sophisticated ways why people were never going to do anything about climate change, because no rational actor ever would, because it outstripped the temporal and spatial boundaries of all of our jurisdictions and all of our personal concerns. And I thought this must mean that if this problem, taken both in itself and as a sort of emblem of the scale and intensity of ecological environmental challenges generally today, that this is one whose nature is such that if we grapple with it, I don't even want to say if we solve it, if we grapple with it in a meaningful way that gives us space to continue grappling with it productively and maybe even be glad we've done it in a way that is something more than a little less afraid, we'll be different people when we've done it. We'll be changed by the process of that engagement. And this would certainly not be the first time that was true in politics. It's true about human community and human identity at many levels, just over the course of the politics of the last 500 years. Think of the politics and culture and lived experience of gender diversity, just to give a very easy contemporary example, which has lots of problems in the analogy, of course. So the book is partly historical, in part because I went back into the past looking for existence proofs first, to answer the question of whether people had in fact reoriented their sense of identity and the scope of their collective possibility in part around ideas of the natural world, what its value might be, of what it would mean to get right by it, or how we might live in relation to it, and also to some degree to try to find resources for thinking forward. All of those are, in a sense, resources for thinking environmentally and thinking ecologically, that they don't overcome the gaps of institutions and politics to try to act in a planetary way. And so in that sense, to talk about a democratic Anthropocene is to write a kind of imaginative literature. I mean, we're making up what it might be, and we hope that it's a generative literature.
For me, nature is still pretty passive and static. I wonder if for you, nature can serve as animal in rethinking our humanity, can really have this agency, not only just providing a landscape to be shaped of and to react to this action. So I'm actually thinking of Lacan when Lacan says that at some moment there are some odd spots in this nature, like the moon or the grass or something that gazes back at you and makes you suddenly realize that you're not the subject that is self-sufficient. But the problem is that, I mean, it is psychology, psychoanalysis, it is still a projection of your own desire or identity or destiny or something like that. So is there really this agency that can intervene into the human society or human world? Thank you.
It's a wonderful question. Many of you will know that there is a lot of creative work being done in different divisions of the humanities now, sometimes under the label of post-humanism, sometimes under the level of new materialism or new animism, and also work in political theory about trying to bring our relations with other species into the language of, for example, citizenship, sovereignty, rights, but not even so much rights in the sort of 1970s era environmental or animal rights movement sense, as in the sense of trying to find a way to coexist with them politically. Um, I find all of this at once terrifically imaginatively rich and provocative. I love what happens when you start to describe a landscape as acting upon the people who are engaged with it, or thinking of human identity as relational with respect to other species. There are also anthropologists doing interesting work in what they call interspecies ethnography. Um, at the core of this, I guess, for me, is a response that will feel very antique and rationalist to some, which is a kind of an idea influenced by Thomas Hobbes and post-Hobbesian political theorists that says that there is something um, indispensable in the role of language in politics, because language is the means by which artificial um, pre-commitments to definite forms of coordination are established. And inasmuch as politics is in part a uniquely um, a distinctive form of artificial homemaking or habitat making whose material is language. There is something that is there's a barrier that's very difficult to cross between us and those with whom we don't share a linguistic medium. But I think that, to my mind, that throws the burden back on democratic politics to be non-anthropocentric and to open itself up to the active, imaginative, and sympathetic engagement of trying to sort of think the world as something we're related to and mutually constitutive with, but which is also uncanny to us in some way. That we can't actually speak to the mind behind the eyes, and that gap is deeper and more difficult than the gap between us, in part because it lacks this artificial means that we have of building bridges that are good enough for us.
What I was hearing were two problems that democratic anthropocenic interventions right pose to us, and one is distance, and then the other is scale, and those two things are kind of related. And so I just wondered if you might be able to talk about those two problems overtly, like so the issue of connecting hidden but seemingly interdependent scales, right, that produce some of these unequal um, ecological impacts, and how we might address those kinds of problems that are both an issue of scale jumping that we might have to do, right, and ways of bringing what's distant much closer to home.
I think it's a kind of what you've just said is a perfect expression of two dimensions of the problem. I I will say this is a sort of, I'm afraid it's going to be more of a negative observation, not about what you said, but about our prospects for doing this, um, because I don't yet find myself holding on to a kind of administrative or managerial or regulatory program that I think is kind of distinctively up to the scale of the problems. And I think that's partly true because what makes such a regime adequate or inadequate is partly, of course, its relation to the goals it's set, but we don't even have um, polity that's in a position to set the purposes that would let us measure the success or failure of the system, right? So it's a set of technical problems, problems of challenges of implementation, of comprehension, prediction, and control that you're talking about. And in a sense, my response is to want to take one step further back and say, beyond the sort of bare level of of averting catastrophe, and even what counts as catastrophe is going to be contested, which is part of what I mean by giving the sketch of a dystopian Anthropocene, which is going to feel perfectly normal and unsurprising to some people who are not doing too poorly under it. We're not even sure what the measure, how to establish the measure of success, and so what the measure would be. So the sort of negative thing that I actually wanted to say, I don't mean to, well, anyway, one has to do negative thinking too, is that I think there has proven to be in the ideology of the neoliberal Anthropocene a very powerful affinity between the complexity, the information overload, and the multiple intersecting scales of ecology, and the same qualities in markets as theorized by Hayek and other information-oriented sort of late neoclassical, social theoretic neoclassical economists. Um, the, the kind of ecology that people start thinking after the 1970s and the kind of markets that they start thinking after the 1970s, which both rely on the idea that unstable, shifting systems are characterized by flows of heterogeneous information that no single eye or decision maker could ever hope to see, and so which have to be organized in a decentralized way that can be uniquely coordinated by price signals, by markets. Produces a kind of affinity between these two ideas that makes the language of natural capital and the language of ecosystem services seem natural and obvious. To me, that is our era's naturalization of a certain version of political economy in relation to nature. Like, of course, we'll say, of course, nature is an information problem, just like markets are an information problem. So we'll make markets out of nature. And we will, in consequence, reproduce not only a certain kind of effectiveness, but also a certain kind of blindness to allocation, to distribution, to capacity, and to the question of the kinds of forms of life that people make within that political economy. So here ends my failure to answer your question, but I hope I've explained why I haven't.
Oh, hi. Yeah, a quick comment, and then I wanted to try to set something. I think we're already after. That's my. We're after.
Nature.
We're just after.
Okay.
Anyway, so about 30 minutes south of here, and about 20 minutes south of Chapel Hill, where I live, there's a little gig going up that's called benignly named Chatham Park. So 7,000 acres of, but some of it had already been cut and reforested, but I think about half of it was as close as we would come to sort of old growth in this part of North Carolina. So 7,000 acres will be cut. And I think the Triangle Land Conservancy estimate was 150 square miles of Haw River watershed will be hardened. So this is the sort of an Oz dreamed up by the SaaS software company over in Cary, and I went down to see the first sort of citizens gathering, Pittsburgh Matters gathering down there, and I went to the last town council meeting where the democratically elected. I'm sorry, I grew up in North Carolina, so I know what a yokel is. Voted their 7,000 acres down the Haw River, rezoned it. And this happened over a period, the last couple of years. A little bit of it's tied up in court still, but there were no joint symposia by the Nicholas School for the Environment, Institute for the Environment at UNC, whatever they call their Department of Regional and Urban Planning over at UNC. Absolutely no interest whatsoever shown by any of the universities, what's going on. Only the heartwarmingly gentle Hall River Assembly showed up, and the Triangle Land Conservancy showed up.
Did they bring puppets?
Pardon?
Did they bring puppets?
They didn't. Not even the Raging Granny showed up for this one. I'll come quickly to my point. Even it's not a movement. We can't kid ourselves about the sort of turf warring, backbiting environmental community in North Carolina. NC Warren, Sierra Club, this crowd, none of them showed up. Okay, so talk about the uncanny. How is this possible? How is this possible that 7,000, they're calling it, this is sort of, I don't know where Levittown, Pennsylvania is. I know a little bit about the situation or whatever happened up there, but that's what they're calling this. Nobody shows up. No one shows up for this. The university class, the intellectual class, the professor class does not show up for any of these things. Not even the environmental folks show up for it. Chamber of Commerce shows up for it. North Carolina Home Builders Association shows up for it. And all the rest is a private land deal between SAS and these poor, struggling town council people down in Pittsburgh. They give it all away. They give it away. And I've dug myself a very deep hole now. I don't know if you'd like to comment on any of that. How's it possible? How's it possible? How does this happen? Second decade of the 21st century, Duke, UNC, NC State, they're all around here. And nobody goes down there. Nobody even takes a look.
So you don't sound like you're surprised by this, and I'm not surprised by this. So I'm just inclined to let that hang in the air as a challenge to all of us myself. A friendly challenge. Would you?
Friendly challenge.
Yeah.
I have a slightly different direction of question than that. I wanted to get back to the question about what the word neoliberal is doing in neoliberal Anthropocene. And so I'd had a question that you kind of got to in the question you answered, not then pretended like you didn't answer, but I felt like it was a good answer. So I'm wondering what the word neoliberal gets that words like capitalism or capitalist don't. I'm wondering if you could say more about that, so that what is, so what's neoliberal about that kind of neoliberal Anthropocene? And then the second question is, probably the answer is I should read the book. Like, when we tell our students it's on the syllabus. So I'm looking forward to doing that. But I'm wondering if you've thought about one of the questions I'm thinking about a lot in my research. By the way, I'm Christine Folch. I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I work in environmental humanities.
You got here recently.
Yeah.
It's wonderful that you're here.
Yeah,
I've been so
thanks.
excited about the idea of you, and there you are.
Yeah, we should hang out. So one of the things I'm trying to think about is was kind of framed by what you said when you said, so of course nature is an information problem, just like markets are an information problem. So let's make a market out of nature, right? And so one of the questions I'm interested in, and I wonder if you've thought about it some as well, is okay, so how then are new kinds of currencies circulating in these markets, and what kind of eco-currencies can you imagine and envision? I'm particularly interested in megawatts as currency, or megawatt hours, so electricity as currency. But just thinking, so it's two questions: what's the neoliberal doing as opposed to capitalist, and then what kinds of currencies do you see potentially circulating in these new markets, not just information? Thank you.
Briefly, first off, on the first question, I more and more think, and I think that would be reflected in the book if I finished it now rather than finishing it when I did, that the word neoliberal can be made useful, but I'm not sure that I actually think it's less useful than the word capitalism. I think it describes a shifting series of argumentative moves that can be mapped that add up to the claim there is no alternative, and sort of opportunistically move among adaptations of classical liberal justifications of certain forms of markets, but with a different relation to the state, different relation to the sort of moral idea of the person in ways that, what to say, it's an interesting discourse, and I think that it's really sort of getting at a subset of the global domination of global capital, and that's actually the thing that's more interesting to talk about. There's this attack, one of many attacks on the Anthropocene term that got one of its expressions in an essay in Jacobin magazine this March, saying that the term is empty in a bunch of ways, but above all, I don't think that Malm actually said it in this piece, but others advanced the thought along the same lines. We should call it the Capitalocene, because there's no undifferentiated human species to be the anthropo, but there is certainly a global capital regime or network of regimes that is actively shaping the planet. So I think I think that's not wrong. I think in relation to that, Anthropocene is a kind of gambit to ask whether a world that has been united in fact, often without any say-so, can be united in mind and action. To use an old distinction, kind of world that has been made one in itself, be made one for itself. That's part of how I think about the relation between sort of Capitalocene and Anthropocene as a sort of step off to the side of agreeing with you that neoliberal doesn't add a lot to capitalist or ism. The point about currencies is great, because it's currencies and not markets in the abstract that actually constitute the claims that move stuff around and move people around and to do the disruption, right? So we know that some of the forms of commoditization are that is ecological forms that are being commoditized into highly abstracted forms, include wetlands in an area that has almost actually nothing much to do with the global climate regime, but is under the Clean Water Act. Sulfur emissions under the Clean Air Act. And then when we get sort of more interesting and global under emerging, mostly regional and global climate eco markets, forest capacity for carbon uptake and for other not incidental, but non sort of climate core benefits like soil stabilization and water flow stabilization. Soil capacity for carbon uptake. All of these become, as the very confusing Pope said recently, objects of speculation and global transfer via their commoditization. I don't know if I've sort of spoken to the heart of your second question. This is just a list of examples. I think we're only really starting to begin to see what it looks like when you've commoditized these sort of ecological facts. I think as actually with the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act instruments, we don't really know what the mechanisms end up doing. I know that we are now almost 10 minutes past our official end time, so I feel like people should not be at all self-conscious if they need to go. But maybe we should also have one more question. Oh, yeah, great. Why don't we take both, and then I'll say anything I have to say. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you very much for your talk today. My question and my observation and question is on a very practical level, and that is how do we get young people, and I'm talking about people in grade school, junior high school, how do we get them interested enough in nature to even consider, provinciality, romanticism, blah, blah, all this stuff that we're talking very highbrow about here. When the children today, and I think I see it in my grandchildren and other people that I talk to, and that is kids don't spend any time outside. And when they are outside, if they're running the path, we work at Duke Gardens, they've got their earbuds in, and they're not hearing the water, they're not hearing the birds. How do we break through this small group of us? How do we break through to those children?
My question was going to be about the qualification of Anthropocene with neoliberalism or democracy. And I think there's some value to thinking about the term Anthropocene beyond these qualifications, because we need to sort of get at what were the sort of technologies that created the Anthropocene. So people have spoken about capitalism, modern industrialism. Some even go back and say like it's nomadic, like when you converted from nomadic to settler colonialism. And I think that will hint to the answer, which may not be the modern democratic answer to that sort of problem of Anthropocene if we sort of just sort of look at what the technology was.
Oh, wait, you totally owe me one more sentence. That's
Right.
much too suggestive a place to stop.
Well, I was gonna. So I was thinking that if the solution to it is democratic Anthropocene, and thinking of democracy as very much of a sort of a modern system of existence in a way, it links up with the kind of reference to Wordsworth that you spoke about learning from nature, but it doesn't link up with other things about being with nature, which other Native Americans, indigenous groups, and other kind of like spiritual ways of being not only had, but continue to have that sort of relationship. So that doesn't really get into the realm of what we understand today as democracy.
I'll respond in reverse order and just stop me and break in if I'm not speaking to you in a sense. I think that one of the ways that we are after nature, if not after, though maybe we're after, is that there's an implicit monotheism in the way that people like Wordsworth talk about nature. Nature is really the bodying forth of a single universal mind, which we get access to through its fragments. And I find that one of the features of our partly made, partly found continuum between human work and the work of everything else. Work, by the way, to your comment, is I think a metaphor that's really interesting to think of substituting for capital when we think about what does nature do, the sort of work of social reproduction. We do the work of social reproduction, we do it in relation to the rest of the world. Anyway, I think that something more polytheistic, if you will, or animist actually becomes more plausible in a sense. Do I relate to nature? Well, sort of, because I am in a certain definite way an inheritor of a Wordsworthian imagination, but in my more concrete ways, I think I relate much more to places and parts and fragments of a half-made world, and that's a much more animist kind of instinct. I similarly think that if we want to try to have a democratic politics that includes an effort to be open to listening, responding to, imagining the experiences of other forms of life, that's also sort of deeply pluralist. You know, we don't want to know what God wants us to do with the buffalo. We want to know what the pigs in the slaughterhouses are experiencing and how we can try to imagine that. So that I think there's a lot in the move to talk about the technology that makes the Anthropocene and what kind of order it generates that I'm not getting to, but I hope this gets to to part of what you say. So I don't, my closest connection right now to very young kids is to a niece and nephew. So working at the gardens, you're probably closer to the sort of representative sample, or actually an unrepresentative sample, but at least a certain kind of cross-section of young kids. And thank you for being people who work at the gardens. It does seem to me that even though my own relation to the rest of the living world is very much in keeping with a long line of American icons, it's the kind of thing that you could read about in like boys' books from the late 19th century forward, that there are a lot of ways that we have to, and that I think we may be enriched by opening up, for example, to realizing how much of going out to see nature can be in a crack on the sidewalk. It can be in learning about your own gut biome. It can be about a mushroom that's growing on the corner of your street that it turns out you can eat. It's sort of thinking about ecological continuity and the blending of things that are made and things that were already there in ways that don't always involve going to the park, though I am the person who always wants to go to the park still. They may involve being aware of where the food on the table is coming from, you know, thinking about food systems and their sources. You're not satisfied. This is not persuading.
Because they're either in front of their screens. They're in front of their screens or they're on their phone. They've got avatars and they've got all this wonderful stuff that's going on. They don't look at the sidewalk. They don't see the mushroom. That's the problem. And I'm afraid that if our youngsters don't experience nature, they'll never love nature and they'll never strive to protect it.
I have to say, I can't fix that one. I'm not totally pessimistic even about the screens. I think screens are kind of an addictive scourge in my own life and the life of people near me. But nonetheless, they make very powerful kinds of visualization possible, like what the landscape is that we're set in and what the future trajectories of the global atmospheric system are, and that's something. You know, those systems can be used for ecological visualization as well as for escapism. So, I don't know. Thank you all so much for coming. It's nice to talk with you.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.